Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Arlene Montevecchio. I am the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College and a member of the conference planning team. And if you were not at our opening prayer service, I'm delighted to welcome you now to St. Mary's College. The success of the inaugural conference in Ferdinand, Indiana in 2016 was one of the reasons St. Mary's decided to be the host of the second conference. The conference planning team has put together a slate of diverse Catholic women who work for the church and the world and who have much to say about women's leadership, acknowledging what has been painful, nurturing what has promise, and imagining new possibilities for our work. Now, more than ever, the laity, especially women, are called to claim and use our good gifts for the reign of God. One way women have contributed to the church is through carrying out its social mission in hospitals, schools, nonprofits, parishes, and other ministries. Our first keynote speaker has dedicated her life to this mission in our country and around the world. I have the great privilege now of introducing Joan Rosenhauer, a highly accomplished female leader in the Catholic Church. Joan Rosenhauer is the Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service USA. Ms. Rosenhauer leads the organization's efforts in the U.S. to fulfill its mission of accompanying, serving, and advocating for refugees and displaced people in 50 countries around the world. She is a former Jesuit Refugee Service USA board member and served as Executive Vice President of Catholic Relief Services, where she led the organization's U.S. outreach, marketing and communications, and advocacy work. Prior to joining CRS, Ms. Rosenhauer was the Associate Director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the USCCB. She's been awarded honorary doctorates from Dominican College and St. Ambrose University. Please join me now in welcoming Joan Rosenhauer to deliver her keynote address.
Good evening. It is great to be with you. I didn't have the joy of attending the first conference, but I'm really delighted to be here and to be a part of this discussion. I want to say a word about my background and a little bit of what I'm going to speak about and what I'm not going to speak about. So, as you heard, I had worked at the USCCB, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, for many years, but before that, I got into that. I became a church bureaucrat because I had been a community organizer. And, yes, and we're going to hear another one of those. What I learned as a community organizer is that the Catholic Church is an amazing source of support for this important work to help low-income people in their communities lead their own lives and lead their own communities through the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Woo, okay, good. And that led me to work for CCHD, and I ended up spending 9 years working for the bishops of the United States at the USCCB. And then I went to work for Catholic Relief Services, which is the Bishop's International Relief and Development Agency, kind of the official agency of the church in the United States. And then finally, for the last year and a half, I've been working with the Jesuits at Jesuit Refugee Service. I want to draw on this experience to discuss both opportunities and challenges that I think we face as women in the church, and in particular, as women leaders in the church. But as I said, this also has implications for what I won't discuss. I am not an expert on the tradition and teaching regarding what official roles women can and cannot hold, why we can't be ordained, and things like that. I think it is critical that we have women and men who are experts on the teaching and tradition on these matters and who can present this clearly and accurately. And I think we need to share this teaching as broadly as we can so that we are all working from the same understanding and the same foundation on which we can base discussions about appropriate interpretations of that teaching and tradition. One of the challenges we face on these topics is that many Catholics are not familiar with church teaching and tradition on the roles of women. It reminds me of the many years of the discussion on the church's position on immigration policies. I've so often heard Catholics criticize the bishops for their position in support of comprehensive immigration reform, only to realize that those Catholics who are objecting to the bishop's position know almost nothing about the teaching behind that position. Their position was more influenced by cable news than by the teaching of the church. And I think sometimes the same thing can be said about church teaching on the roles of women in the church. So I applaud the people who are bringing expertise on our tradition and teaching as it relates to the roles of women in the church. And I think we all need to support them and lift up their work so that there is much broader and greater understanding of that teaching and tradition on which we can base a discussion about the future official roles in the church, of women in the church. But that's not my area of expertise. So what I want to do is to draw on my experience in various levels of leadership in the church and discuss what I see as the opportunities and challenges moving forward. I believe the first thing that we need to acknowledge is that women have been and currently are playing essential leadership roles in the church. Look at the incredible leadership that we've seen throughout history in the history of the church, going back to the Old Testament, of the role of women in the church, and that was so beautifully acknowledged during our prayer this evening. I immediately thought also, and in our prayer, we honored Mary Magdalene and the women who were the first witnesses that Christ had risen from the dead. So many women saints and others who have been strong leaders. I started thinking about Catherine of Siena and Elizabeth Ann Seton and Dorothy Day, and before you know it, we could spend the whole day, or evening, I guess, listing all of those amazing, amazing women. One of the things we heard about in our prayer was the Holy Cross sisters who started this university, or this college, and what amazing women they must have been to come over from France at that time. I guess they were held back by the bishop for a while, but they persevered and they ended up being here and starting the school, and how remarkable they are. And there are countless women who are playing critical roles as theologians and as teachers and preachers, even in, not the traditional sense of preaching, but I just had the blessing of being able to participate in Catholic Women Preach, which is a wonderful example of women reflecting on scriptures and sharing their insights. And today we see women in leadership roles in many important ministries directly related to the work that I do in the social mission of the church and the related service ministries of the church. Catholic Charities USA, for example, is led by Sister Donna Markham, and all over this country, Catholic Charities agencies and other Catholic social service agencies are led by remarkable women who are making a huge difference in their communities. In Catholic healthcare, Sister Mary Haddad has just taken over after the impressive tenure of Sister Carol Keehan. Look at the impact of Catholic healthcare now led by women in this country. And there are women serving as presidents of Catholic colleges and universities all across the United States. I couldn't begin to name them all, but one of them is the interim president here at St. Mary's. And we can also see women in leadership roles and how essential they are at other levels, not just at the national level or at major institutions, but in dioceses where women are serving as chancellors and are serving as directors of critical ministries in the diocese, and in parishes where, in many cases, parishes would hardly function if it weren't for women, right? We all know parishes that are like that, right? Mine is one of them, yes, exactly. Here's to the women who are making parishes, be strong. So as I said, I spent 16 years at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and then 9 more years at Catholic Relief Services, the Bishops' International Relief and Development Agency. And I found that I was able to work very effectively with bishops and with other clergy on projects, and that I often felt my ideas and opinions were very much respected. And there were a number of women in senior leadership roles in those institutions who were treated with respect and were valued by the people who reported to them in the structure, including the priests. So it's important to affirm that there are many men in the church, including clergy, who respect and honor women as leaders. One of the church leaders I had a chance to get to know during my time at CRS is the president of Caritas Internationalis, Cardinal Tagle of Manila. He is an incredibly committed man to the well-being of humanity, really, to the well-being of especially the people on the margins, and he devotes his life to advancing their well-being. And he recently tied that directly to the importance of honoring women when he said, "We cannot promote the humanity of all without promoting the dignity of women." Most recently, in my work with Jesuits, I'm finding that more and more the Jesuits are establishing very effective models of partnership with women in leadership roles. For example, I'm the executive director of Jesuit Refugee Service USA, and I'm the first woman to hold this position. Yes, the women. And I have Jesuits who report to me, and I have Jesuits who are my peers. And I find that they treat me with respect. They honor my leadership and my opinions. But I especially saw the commitment to partnership with women among the Jesuits as JRS is developing during a recent trip to Jordan and Lebanon, where I met our regional director, who is a Jesuit from Syria, our country director in Jordan, who is a Muslim woman, and our country director in Lebanon, who is a Druze woman. All of them working together in partnership, we're carrying out essential programming to support refugees, especially those fleeing the wars in Syria and Iraq, which is so important to respond to at this time. Not only were they lifting up the leadership of women within the organization, within JRS, but our work and the work of many international agencies is making significant progress in affirming and supporting the leadership of women in some of the most difficult circumstances. When there is a crisis, it's often the women who must lead their families as they flee violence and other threats in order to seek safety in new countries and new homes, and in order to try to save the lives of their children. Their husbands and fathers may have been killed in fighting or may have stayed behind to try to protect the family's home or business. I was particularly struck by the resilience of women leaders in these crisis situations during a recent trip I made to Chad. And whenever I tell the story of this trip, I always like to ask people in the room, especially if there are some people that are like over 25, how many of you remember when every night on the news we saw the story of the genocide in Darfur? Do people remember the genocide in Darfur and how horrible that was, and it was on the news every night and stuff? Well, the sad thing is that our news cycle moved on, and probably most of us in this room moved on. But those refugees from Darfur are still in eastern Chad, living in refugee camps all these years later. It's been 15 years. And they're still in these camps, living in grass huts, trying to do the best they can for their families there. And I met a young woman who had come as a very young person and moved to this camp with her family. And one of the things that refugees, and especially women, and girls are getting more and more access to education, refugees want their children to be educated. They want their education, and it's something that JRS really focuses on. And this young woman desperately wanted to get her education. She dreamed of being a teacher. And that was something we could prepare her for and something that she would be allowed to do in Chad. In some countries, refugees can't work, but in Chad, they can be teachers. So she had this dream, but as is typical, you know, she's living her life. She's already much delayed in her education because of the time of fleeing. And in the course of her education, before she finished high school, she got married. And then she started having babies. And she started getting that dream of being a teacher kind of derailed with a focus on her family. But both she and her husband wanted to finish their education. They both had kind of gotten their education derailed. They both wanted to finish their education. She, in particular, wanted to be a teacher. So they came back to the schools that JRS runs, and she immediately ran into the challenge of, well, it's kind of twofold. They didn't have the money for both of them to go to school. And secondly, she had babies to take care of, including one baby that she was still nursing. And she was so determined that she just would not stop until women like her had a way to finish their education. And she was the inspiration behind setting up a nursery. Her husband was, I mean, she's such a strong kind of influential woman that she even shaped her family. And in an unusual situation, her husband dropped out of school so she could stay in school. And he started a little barbershop business so that he could support the family. And working with her, we set up a nursery so that now any young women who want to get an education can continue their education even when they have babies, because they can slip out and nurse their children when they need to. Anyway, all of that is to say that women are resilient everywhere in the world. The determination and resilience of these impressive women is a reminder of the strength women bring to leadership roles in every setting and in every part of the world. And when we need to, or when we have the opportunity in the church and in society, women step up and we play critical, effective leadership roles. My point is that it's important as we explore the topic of women in the church that we acknowledge the ways in which our experiences have been positive and we have already played an impactful role as leaders. We need to start by recognizing and honoring the highly effective leadership women are already providing in the church. But this is not the general perception. It's not the prevailing narrative about the church and women, and we need to change that. Women already provide strong models of leadership for everyone in the church, including clergy. These are models that should be the norm, should be honored, and should be widely recognized. And we need to tell this story. We need to focus our attention and the world's not just on what women haven't been able to do in the church, but on what we've done. We've done a lot, and we cannot let our impact be diminished by a focus only on the men, generated by both their strengths, but also, sadly, as we all know, their failures. We need to own and lift up our place in the church. Now, I don't want to paint too bright a picture about the roles and experiences of women, because there is also much evidence that we are still far from where we need to be in the church and beyond. I saw a couple of days ago a reference to an article in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how women fall behind men in the workplace very early in their careers, and then they have a very difficult time catching up. And I wasn't able at the time to really read the article, but I thought, well, this is kind of interesting in light of our topic here. Might be that that happens in the church too. So I Googled the article, and what I was shocked to see was that there was this long list of articles from various publications and sites just in the last 2 weeks on women falling behind men in the workplace. Clearly, in many contexts, including in the church, we have a lot more progress to make. In the church, I believe we can only make progress if we acknowledge the role clericalism has played where there has been a failure to honor and promote the leadership of women. We have seen the importance of women leaders in the church eclipsed or lost, or at least seriously diminished in the narrative about the church, as the central focus has been the men, especially the clergy, who have had primary leadership roles. And sadly, recently, what the world has focused on has been an unimaginable failure of leadership and character by the clergy. The Catholic Church is now known for exactly the opposite of what it should be known for. One thing that I think can help us moving forward that has come out of the abuse crisis is that clericalism has become a major topic of discussion. It challenges us to unpack the impact of clericalism in our church. Now, you can't talk about clericalism without confronting the challenge of its definition. And I would guess that if we asked the 150 or so people who are attending this conference to define clericalism, we'd probably get 150 similar but slightly different definitions. So I decided to go to two key sources for a definition. First, Merriam-Webster defines clericalism as, very simply, a policy of maintaining or increasing the power of a religious hierarchy. What struck me about this in particular is that it accurately reflects one of the core problems of clericalism in our church, and that is this question of power. Pope Francis captures this very clearly when he said recently, "Clericalism confuses priestly service with priestly power. Clericalism is rise and rule." The culture of clericalism that has focused on the power of the clergy has warped our understanding of leadership in the church. It's warped the experience that the faithful have of the church, and it's warped the ministry of the clergy. What got lost is servant leadership. The idea that at the heart of being a disciple of Christ is a commitment to always love and serve others, including, maybe especially, through leadership roles. How can clergy represent Christ if they are more focused on their own advancement, their own desires and comforts, and protecting themselves and their fellow clergymen than on serving the people God has entrusted to their care, especially the most vulnerable? The church should be known for the opposite of what has been most visible to the public in recent months and years. This hit home for me when I was with a group of millennials a few days ago who are cradle Catholics and remain connected to the church, more than many millennials are connected to the church. One of them wondered if church organizations would be speaking out on International Day of the Girl Child in support of girls. The others laughed and said the church doesn't have any credibility to speak out on the International Day of the Girl Child. What a situation we're in, when even young people who are still involved with the church believe the leaders of the church don't have the credibility to speak out on behalf of the dignity of girls. Another dimension of clericalism and the failure of a culture of servant leadership in the church is a focus on entitlement. We see this in the worst of the church's problems. Let's be clear that the Catholic Church is not the only place where this problem is found. Sadly, far from it. But we, the church, should be a model of service, not entitlement, for anyone who interacts with us. Instead, in too many cases, our leaders have focused more on what they feel they are owed because of their position and power than on being grateful for the gifts they have received, including the blessing of the people they serve as leaders. One of the things I've most appreciated since I've joined Jesuit Refugee Service is learning more about and being more focused in my own life on Jesuit spirituality and spiritual practices, especially the examen. It ensures that every day I am intentional about reflecting on how many gifts God has given me and how grateful I am. It has really changed my whole perspective as a person, as a leader, to focus so much on gratitude. In short, instead of a leadership culture focused on power, our values as disciples of Christ should shape leadership in the church. Values of service, of love for others, of humility, and of gratitude. As St. Teresa of Avila once said, "Always think of yourself as everyone's servant. Look for Christ our Lord in everyone, and you will then have respect and reverence for them all." Sadly, for too many Catholics, including Catholic leaders, Our values don't shape everything we do. I mentioned earlier the experience with immigration policy. In a kind of related experience, I at one point was involved in doing some market research on people's attitudes, Catholics' attitudes about immigration policy. And so we were gathering people who were attending Mass at least once a month, so they were fairly active Catholics, and asked them how the values of their faith, such as loving their neighbor and welcoming the stranger and caring for the least among us, how did that shape their attitude? Because everyone that we included in this focus group opposed, they were somewhere on the range of opposing welcoming migrants into this country. They opposed legalization for undocumented people and things like that. So they were asked, how do the values of your faith shape your attitude about these policies? And the odd thing was that in these focus groups, people they had a head tilt moment. They were like, well, I haven't really thought about that. I guess I have to give some thought to that. And I was shocked watching this happen. I couldn't imagine that people who are active enough to come to Mass once a month don't think about how the values of their faith shape their attitudes about these policies. But apparently that's the way it is. And sadly, I think too often the values of our faith don't shape what we do every day, the political decisions we make, but the decisions we make as leaders and the approach we take to leadership. And we need to refocus ourselves on the role of the values of our faith in our approach to leadership. And it may mean that we should be different from what you typically get in a business school or in other settings around training for leadership. So, again, I feel compelled to affirm that I have known many exemplary leaders in the church. Testing everything we do against the values of our faith is especially important for those in leadership roles. And many of the leaders I've known have been models of having the core values of their faith and the faith that we hold as disciples of Christ shape their approach to leadership. I've known men who are committed servant leaders. They use their gifts for the common good. They take great joy in serving those who work with them and others in their lives, nearby and on the other side of the world, whenever and wherever they are in need. I've also known remarkable women who uphold a model of servant leadership in the church and in countless other settings. They are strong but humble. They commit every day to promoting the best for all people they encounter and serve. These are the models we need to bring to the center of the culture of the church. As lay women, we have a key role, an essential role, in shaping this culture. And this is an important moment for us and an important opportunity. Women have to be at the center of rebuilding the church and being models of servant leadership. But I also want to offer a word of caution, a challenge regarding women as leaders in the church. We have to be careful not to be too smug about our superior leadership style. We haven't cornered the market on integrity or humility or a commitment to service. We aren't inherently more focused on gratitude than on entitlement, or more committed to transparency and accountability than self-protection. Sadly, I have definitely seen women in leadership roles, including in the church, who fall far short of being servant leaders. They have been more focused on how right they are than on humility, more focused on listening to the wisdom of their colleagues. They've been more focused and convinced about the importance of their roles than supportive of the roles of others that work with them. We have to be as careful, we as women have to be as careful as we need to expect the men in the church to be, not to lose our commitment to discipleship centered on bringing God's love into the world. Even though I firmly believe women have a key role to play in building a new culture of leadership in the church, The very act of suggesting this contains the risk of arrogance and self-importance. We have to hold ourselves accountable and not assume that women will automatically be strong leaders given the chance. The culture of the church in the future has to hold all people, women and men, clergy and lay, to the same standard, a standard of self-sacrifice, of servant leadership, of a commitment to love those we encounter and recognize Christ in them, a commitment to the common good. Women bring great models of this type of leadership, but we can't be too complacent and fail to hold ourselves accountable. Women can and should embrace a strong partnership with men in the church, and together we should lead the way in reinforcing a culture focused on gratitude, service, humility, and accountability. We know that we are living in a demoralizing time in our church. It is heartbreaking that the abuse crisis has destroyed trust for so many, and they're leaving. And I'm sure many of you saw the headline from the Pew study this week on religion in the United States. The headline I saw is, "In U.S., decline of Christianity continues at a rapid pace." But despite these challenges, we have to recognize this as a moment of opportunity and hope. I really believe that. Carrying on just as we have been doing is not an option for us. We have no choice but to ask ourselves what it looks like to be great leaders in the church. At the heart of the answer to that question is servant leadership, involving, as I've said, service, self-sacrifice, transparency, accountability, a commitment to the common good. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to be at the center of change in the church, so that someday young people think of our church first when they think of who stands for compassion and kindness, for building a better world, standing up for vulnerable girls, or for any vulnerable people around the world. What I have tried to do tonight is to lift up four of the things, not the four things, but four of the things that we need to do as women in the church. First, we need to tell the story of women leaders in the church and own the role we have already played and will play in strengthening our community of faith. We need to change the narrative that women have not played important roles throughout the history of the church, and make sure that women are at the center of the church, past and present. We need to promote servant leadership to overcome a leadership culture in our church that has too often been focused on power and self-promotion and self-preservation. We need to challenge ourselves to that type of leadership that in many ways is countercultural in our society. 3, we need to commit to holding ourselves accountable. We know that being servant leaders isn't easy, and we must constantly guard against assuming that we have a special answer just because we're women, that we will be the answer to leadership in the church. We have to hold ourselves to a high standard, and we have to figure out how to do that for ourselves individually and for each other. And then 4, finally, we need to seize the moment. The evidence is clear that change is needed in the culture of leadership in the church. Helping to lead this change is worth doing, but it has to be done right, with humility and a commitment to partnership with all church leaders, including clergy and other men. Look at the person to your left and to your right. We are the people, and I can see you from this perspective, it's great. We are the people who can build this new culture for the church. And I'm delighted to be a part, and I'm delighted to see men in the room as well as women, and to be a part, yes. Because together, we can be the ones that can be at the heart of changing the culture of the church, of turning around the perception that women cannot be leaders, are not leaders, and that the church has just failed in its commitment to discipleship, the principles of discipleship. We can turn that around. And together, the people in this room, I'm honored to be with you, and I would love to open up a conversation with you about this. So I think there will be some microphones going around, and I'd love to hear your experiences, your reactions to what I've said, and your thoughts about how do we change the culture of leadership in the church and make sure that women are at the heart of it.